Introducing the right-wing war on education, starring Betsy DeVos, evangelical Christians, and a few dudes who rented out strip malls, called themselves schools, and stole your public school tax dollars.
And on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals. Amen.
In this hour, we'll talk about how Republicans want to dumb our kids down and what we have to do to stop them. As always, leading the conversation is Patti Vasquez. But with her, we have Kirk Bangstad of the Minocqua Brewing Company, who is leading the charge to get rid of the parasitic voucher school system in Wisconsin. And a few fellow public education warriors he brought along to educate us. The right-wing war on education is brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company. Take it away, Patti.
Yes, and welcome to the right-wing war on education. And thank you so much to our incredible sponsor, Kirk Bangstad, the mastermind behind Minocqua Brewing Company. Every Thursday, we shine a light on how Republicans are trying to take tax dollars away and divert them to private schools, to charter schools, strip mall schools. They want to dumb down our kids and remove access to public schools. And Kirk, tell us a little bit about what you intend to do with this series, because I know you have taken this to the courts. You are not messing around.
We are not messing around, Patti. We're going to, in about 2 weeks, we're going to file a lawsuit to sue the state of Wisconsin to overturn the parasitic voucher school system, private school voucher school system in Wisconsin. But my goal was, if you file a lawsuit, there's still a ton of misinformation in the public about the reasons that private voucher schools are actually good when they're not good. And so I don't want to just sue in court and have the wrong story be told on why we're doing this. And so for the next, every Thursday until we run out of stuff to talk about, which I don't believe is going to exist,
Nope.
we're going to talk about how these private voucher schools negatively affect public schools, how they, and what we've done. The first week we did this, we introduced our lawyers who are all going to bring the suit. We introduced what our claims are going to be, or around roughly. And then last week we talked about the history of Wisconsin's voucher program, which is the oldest in the state, or oldest in the United States. But this week we wanted to look at it from a national level, because this is a Republican long game across the nation to destroy public schools. And even though Wisconsin's program is the oldest, it's probably worse, I'm guessing, and we'll talk to our guests soon enough. It's probably worse in other states where it's less purple and more red. So with that being said, I wanted to introduce the guest that we can't believe we got her on the show. She's a brilliant lawyer. Her name is Jessica Levin, and I got to make sure I get all this right. She's the director of. She works for the Educational Law Center, and she's the director of the Public Funds Public Schools, which is a national campaign run by the Education Law Center that ensures public funds for education are used to support public schools. Jessica holds degrees from Cornell, Oxford, and Harvard, and she's been fighting for kids and for public schools for a long time. Thanks so much for joining us, Jessica.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.
Okay, so the first question I want to ask to kind of lay everything out is, who or what is driving this push for this parasitic private voucher school programs across the nation? What's going on? Who's driving it and why?
It's a really good question. It's a complicated question. I want to just sort of give you first an idea of how big a push this is, if that would be helpful. So for the last decade or so, there's been an accelerated push to spread private school voucher programs across the country. And in the last couple of years, we've seen that push reach a fever pitch. So the number of voucher bills that are being introduced in state legislatures around the country and the number that are being passed in states nationwide has increased significantly. There are some bills in Congress. They're not going to pass right now, probably. We do want to watch Congress, but where this is happening is in the states. And so, for example, in 2021, Public Funds Public Schools, which counts all the voucher bills in state legislatures around the country, counted at least 7 states that passed new voucher programs and at least 14 states that expanded existing programs. And in 2022, we saw some similar numbers. A dozen states passed bills to establish or expand a voucher program. And this year, In 2023, we're tracking about 400 voucher and related bills in state legislatures. Those include proposals to create new programs and to expand existing ones. Some have passed this year again. A lot have been defeated. I'm happy to talk about that more. But let's talk a little bit about the factors that are behind them now. So there are a variety of factors. There's not one element that's pushing this. It is sort of a perfect storm and a confluence of things. First, not most importantly or the biggest one, but here are a bunch of them. So first, the U.S. Supreme Court's recent decisions in a case called Espinoza in 2020 and a case called Carson in 2022, which were about a couple of states and basically whether they had to include religious schools if they funded private schools in vouchers or voucher-like programs. And the U.S. Supreme Court said yes, that if a state funds private schools, it has to also send public funds to religious schools. So a while back, the battle in the courts was about whether a state could fund religious schools at all if it so chose. But now states don't have a choice. If they fund any private schools, they have to fund religious schools. It is really important to note that the court also said states don't have to fund private schools. And so that's really important for policymakers and the public to know there's no legal obligation to fund any private schools whatsoever. But that's one thing that really emboldened privatizers. So there's other factors, but let me stop there.
Let's stop there. That's wild. I didn't know that yet. Patti.
No, I had no idea.
The Supreme Court said if you funded private schools, you have to use public tax dollars to also fund religious schools.
It's not that you can, you have to.
How could they do that? Jessica, how could they do that given our Constitution?
That's right. How could they do that? So, so this is mostly about the First Amendment, and the First Amendment talks about religion, as you know, and has sort of two clauses that deal with religion. The Establishment Clause, saying that the government can't establish religions, favor religion, one religion over others, or religion over non-religion, but also the Free Exercise Clause, that people are entitled to the free exercise of religion. And the Supreme Court's decisions in recent years have sort of elevated the Free Exercise Clause over the Establishment Clause in a lot of these cases, including a lot of these cases are about education, which is where a lot of First Amendment law is made, and where a lot of really important laws made that affects us throughout the country and not just in education. So what the theory is and what the Supreme Court agreed with was that not allowing religious schools to be included in these public programs was discrimination against religion.
So you mentioned that there are a lot of different folks that are doing this and groups. Can you tell us some of the players that are involved in this, who they are, and why they're expanding at such a tremendous rate?
Sure. Well, the influence of really powerful, really well-funded pro-voucher groups is another of these very important factors. And one of those, some of those groups, like a legal group called the Institute for Justice, was responsible for litigating those Supreme Court cases I just mentioned, for example. But there are lots of well-funded players. So people like Betsy DeVos and her American Federation for Children, other groups that you may have heard of and some you may not have heard of, like Ed Choice, Excel in Ed. These are powerful, well-funded pro-voucher groups that are pushing these policies. There are legal groups, and then there are legislative groups.
Jessica, let me, and I'm sure Alec is going to be some of the legislative groups you were going to talk about right there. So these are groups, well-funded groups. I think that's enough of a category to kind of dig into a little bit. To me, there are three reasons these groups exist. But I think the layman's reason is that that these groups want to. They think that public schools are indoctrinating kids into like the democratic way of life or progressive. I don't believe that's the real reason. The second is that we should we want to make our kids more Christian potentially, or it's driving our kids towards a more religious kind of way of life or schooling. I don't think I'm cynical, and I think the real reason is there's, like in private healthcare, which is a complete debacle in the United States. There's a very few amount of people making a hell of a lot of money because they were able to take public tax dollars and privatize an entire system. To me, the Betsy DeVos's of the world are getting rich and more rich because they're funding these groups, which are arguing all the wrong reasons, they're not real reasons to support private schools and voucher schools, but the real reasons are there's a few people getting really rich off of this situation. Can you kind of expand on that and let me know if I'm completely off base?
Well, there's a lot of evidence more and more all the time that voucher programs have a severe lack of accountability for the public funds. Two things that I think are related to what you're saying. One, there's lack of accountability in where the public funds are growing. And once a state enacts private school voucher programs, the amount of money that it diverts to them tends to grow and grow and grow. And I'm happy to go into detail, but there's research, and you can see in the press articles about, what voucher money is being spent on, and very little accountability. And that is a choice. When voucher legislation is passed, you can write in accountability measures or not. And more and over the years, I think that if there's any trend, they never had a lot of accountability, but if there's any trend, it's to less accountability and standards. And that's in the area of academic standards, curriculum standards, health and safety standards, governance and fiscal responsibility standards, oversights and audits. There's very, very little of that in these programs, but more and more money flowing to them.
Okay, this is the heart of what we're trying to expose here and discuss is why is the right wing trying to destroy public education, and why? What's the goal here from your perspective?
The $64,000 question, but only they can tell you their true motivations. But what I can say is the effects of the policies they promote show us that they undermine public education. And I can go into some detail and, what they say. And more, some of the pro-voucher groups have started to say more outright, what they're doing. For example, when Utah was passing its universal voucher law, there was a lobbyist who was caught on tape saying something, I'm paraphrasing, but that the intent was to undermine or destroy public education. And there's a report within the last year or so from the Heritage Foundation, which is pro-voucher, which said outright, let's make vouchers part of the culture wars. We can capitalize, again, I'm paraphrasing, we can capitalize on using the culture wars to push vouchers. So, but I think, the effects of these policies tell you what you need to know, no matter what individuals' motivations might be. The effect is that voucher programs undermine public schools and have lots of other harms, which we can talk about. But one major one is that they undermine public schools and take precious public dollars that we need to put into our already underfunded public education systems.
You mentioned that they could use this as part of their culture wars too, because I know that there are schools that have policies when it comes to LGBTQ plus students, whether it's Florida or Indiana. So essentially, they're also, I guess, reveling in the fact that they can control the student population who can attend and who can't. That's something I hadn't even, I think I heard it in the background, but that's, of course, it has to feed into this as well.
Lots of private schools, not all, but lots have discriminatory policies when it comes to admissions, when it comes to what services they'll provide, when it comes to discipline and what they'll use as bases for discipline and pushing out students that don't conform to what they want in the school. So it's absolutely true that voucher programs are underwriting discrimination with public money.
Okay, so I wanted to move. You said we can get into the weeds a little bit, and I'd like to. You said you can give us a few numbers on how voucher schools around the country undermine public schools. To me, just dumbing down kids so they can't think critically and realize they're being scammed is like the biggest possible one. But I'm sure there's more measurable outcomes. So can you tell us what the top three ways that voucher schools across the country are undermining public schools?
Sure. It's hard to even pick just three. Okay. So first, let me tell you just sort of the massive amounts of money that we see increasingly going to voucher programs and how that's increasing exponentially, and then talk about some of the ways that directly affects our public school funding and resourcing. So just to give you an example, Public Funds Public Schools recently released a report called The Fiscal Consequences of Voucher Programs, and it was written by Dr. Samuel Abrams and Stephen Koutsavlis at Columbia University, and it looked at 7 states. One of them was Wisconsin. Wisconsin, that have had long-running voucher programs, and then documented how those programs have increased in size and in the spending of public funds. So, for example, from 2008 to 2019, that was the period of the study, voucher spending increased in Ohio over 400%, and in Indiana almost 800%. In Wisconsin, in that time period, spending increased from about 141 million to 311 million. And these programs just continue to increase. So even more recently, so Florida was in 2022 diverting about $1.3 billion per year just to its education savings account voucher program, and then another over $1 billion to its what's called a tax credit voucher program. And now we'll be diverting what we in the Florida Policy Institute estimate to be up to $4 billion a year. So that's the first thing to know.
So you're saying basically diverting millions and billions of dollars away that are tax dollars that we've paid, that states, we the people are paying into our states for public schools. Diverting that obviously takes away precious dollars from paying our teachers in public schools, from all the resources that we need to have. So just the diversion of money in and of itself is the biggest monkey in the room, and how these our public schools are being hurt, and potentially destroyed. True.
That's right. And that's against the backdrop of severe and chronic underfunding of our public schools in so many states and in so many districts. And just to take Wisconsin as an example, Education Law Center's Making the Grade report about fair school funding, the last one we put out in 2022, gave Wisconsin a grade of C in overall funding level, which, is a C. I believe a D in funding distribution. So funding distribution measures whether a state is providing higher levels of funding to districts that are serving large concentrations of low income students, or whether it's actually providing equal amounts to more affluent and less affluent districts, or regressive funding so more funding to more affluent districts, which is, obviously common sense, and research tells us that's not what we should be doing. So yes, vouchers divert money from this already underfunded system. And sometimes that's direct diversion. Sometimes the voucher money comes straight from the appropriation to the public schools. But even when it doesn't, there are so many ways that diversion of our public funds generally comes back to haunt our public schools. For example, when students leave public schools, then so much of public school funding is based on per pupil count, right? So the pro-voucher side wants to say that the money follows the student, no harm, no foul, but that's absolutely untrue, because schools have fixed costs. And so when students leave from different grades, different classrooms, the school still has the fixed costs of the busing, the heating, the library, the building, pensions. And so they can't proportionally reduce funding. And so the students who are in public schools, which are still the vast majority of students, are left with fewer resources.
And this has to have such a negative impact on these schools. So what would you say is the most alarming thing that we're seeing? Are there districts that are collapsing? Is this causing an implosion in certain parts of the country?
Well, I think that public schools do an amazing job of functioning even with this chronic underfunding that so many of them experience. But yes, it's well documented in many places that students lack essential educational resources, whether that's facilities that they need to learn safely, whether it's textbooks, whether it's things that go into curriculum, whether it's supports for students with disabilities, for multilingual learners. There's so much need documented, and the diversion of funds to vouchers is the exact opposite of what we need to be doing.
When you talk about, the special education programs, people are like, or I think overall people are like, oh, well, parents should have a choice on where to send their kids. And we've talked a little bit about pushing kids out. And I know that part of that is also kids with disabilities. This isn't really about parents' choice. This is about the schools choosing students, right?
That's absolutely right. It's what we were talking about a little bit before. That under voucher programs, private schools generally are permitted to discriminate on a multitude of factors that public schools could never use, and the public won't accept public schools discriminating on these factors. We shouldn't accept private schools that are publicly funded discriminating on the basis of disability, religion, LGBTQ status, English fluency, past academic performance, past disciplinary history. So excluding students or refusing to serve them or disciplining them if they don't conform to what the private school wants in these areas.
Okay, so Jessica, I want to switch a little bit, and then I got a feeling we're going to have to go to commercial. But to tee up the next half of our show, I wanted to talk about geography a little bit. I mean, you kind of pointed out a few states that kind of were expanding, but can you, I mean, Wisconsin is the oldest program. We're getting C's and D's because of it in public education. Is this, I know it's expanding around the country, but where are pockets, where are the states that are most in danger? I mean, is Wisconsin one of them, or what are the top 5 states that we're seeing really, really huge problems?
Well, so, I guess there are geographic pockets, or in the sense that there are a lot of states in each area of our country that have vouchers, and then many that don't. So, and then many that are pushing back against expansion of vouchers. I think one of the most concerning trends in the last 2 years is universal voucher programs. So voucher programs that have universal eligibility, they're no longer based on income or other factors like students with disabilities. These are voucher programs that allow even the wealthiest families to draw the voucher and subsidize private education that they were already paying for or already could pay for.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. That seems absolutely bonkers. I mean, the whole point of voucher schools, and back in the day, if Milwaukee had a terrible public school system, there was an idea in somebody's head that maybe we give a voucher to one of these inner city kids and they can get out of the mess and go to some school that might be better. That's the whole point. And that's what they've been selling everybody in America on for 30 years. So now you take off all of the like the top, like, if you let everybody, no matter what their income level is, take a voucher that uses public tax dollars and go to a private school, like what's the point of that? I mean, how can they argue that with a straight face to the public? Because given the fact it was for people that were poor in the beginning.
Yeah, I don't think you can. I mean, it was never true that vouchers were going to help even the groups that they started out saying they were going to help, like low-income students or students with disabilities, because the vouchers still didn't make private schools, leaving aside whether they're effective, which research shows they're not more effective than the public schools. But you can't access them with a voucher if you're a low-income family, because the voucher is not going to cover the tuition most of the time, let alone the other expenses that are covered in public schools. If you're a student with disabilities, where education expenses can be very high, the voucher is not going to come close to covering those. And now I agree. I don't think you can say with a straight face that this is mostly benefiting even the groups that you originally said they were going to benefit. There's data from multiple states showing that a vast majority in some of these states of the vouchers are being used by families that were never in public school.
Oh my God. Like there's every week when I think that I've got enough rage build up about how this is happening and why, there's another thing that comes along and the rage. Yeah, that's the point. We need to stay invested and informed on this topic. This is our third installment of the right wing war on education. Joining us is Jessica Levin. I ask how I say your last name? Is that right? Levin? Excellent. And of course, our champion on the battlefield in Wisconsin, Kirk Bangstead from Minocqua Brewing Company. Go to MinocquaBrewingCompany.com and watch this live. We are live streaming this on the WCPT Facebook page, on Minocqua Brewing Company's Facebook page, and the Patti Vasquez Show page. So you got a lot of different options. So join us for the conversation. More after this on WCPT 820, Heartland Signal, and 950 AM KTNF, Minneapolis, St. Paul.
You let me die.
And now back to the right-wing war on education.
I think we're back with our the right-wing war on education, on public education. Look, I graduated from public schools in Chicago. I also went to a parochial school. We all have different stories. Like people will come on, Kirk, and they'll say, I went to Catholic school. I turned out okay. That's not the conversation that we're having. We are talking about this how wrong it is to defund public schools at the expense of kids in order to line the pockets of the wealthy and to have a sort of idea that parents have a choice when they really don't.
Okay, so we've kind of laid down kind of what are some of the most egregious things that are happening to schools around the country, the diverting of public funds for one thing and leaving schools under-resourced. We talked about, in different pockets of America, it's happening all over the place. What I wanted to kind of go positive and negative, but I'm going to start positive. Can you talk about some states? What are the states that have faced this voucher school push that have actually beaten it back and have kind of gotten voucher schools out of their state and have helped public education? Can you talk about some of these, if there are any states that have?
Well, there are lots of states that don't have vouchers, and that's not for lack of effort on the pro-voucher side, but that's because of students, families, teachers, public school advocates who are standing up against it. So some of the states that don't have vouchers, large and small across the country, California, New Mexico, Colorado, Kentucky, due to a court case that was won last year that I can talk more about. Another fantastic example is Texas. Texas has for years and years been beating back the threat of vouchers. There are no vouchers in Texas, and that is due to so many factors and so much hard work of public education advocates, including, again, students, teachers, religious leaders, so many people who come together to stand up for public schools. And so that's a fantastic example. It's also really important that even in places where there are vouchers, there's still a lot of success in beating back expansions. And so all hope is not lost when there's a foot in the door for vouchers. You need to be very wary that they tend to expand. But lots of advocates and others are beating back expansion attempts. And a great example of that this year is Georgia, where they had a fantastic effort that was led by youth and a lot of different advocates and coalitions. So in terms of a place where vouchers have been sort of rolled back once they had started, we're looking to Illinois, another Midwestern state where there's a tax credit voucher program that is supposed to sunset this year. So the legislature would need to act to continue it. And there is a fantastic effort of a lot of groups and coalition, including Illinois Families for Public Schools and so many others who are working on the effort to have that voucher program sunset and make Illinois voucher free again.
Outstanding. Sorry, don't mean to brag, Kirk, but we're doing all right down here. I know. Mean, and that's why we're having this conversation. I mean, because it can be done, is what Jessica is telling us. That's the important part.
What about, so that's great. I also was on the radio promoting this show in Minneapolis earlier today and was told that they've been able to beat back vouchers in Minneapolis too. So, two of the states that surround Wisconsin have figured it out. I never count on Iowa to be more progressive than we are. So I'm guessing they have voucher schools. So that's the positive stuff. And it's so great to hear that there are coalitions and that, even though my super PAC gets called racist because we want to beat back the voucher school system, which is happening on the right in Wisconsin right now, that I don't feel quite as alone, and all the people working with me don't feel quite as alone because we see this happening and getting beaten back by folks in white, white capes and not white hoods, but white capes helping us out. So I want to go to the negative though. Can you tell it? Have you ever thought about, or has anybody ever done any studies on what happens if they win? What happens if the folks who are the Betsy DeVosses of the world, who are kind of funding all these groups, actually succeed in eradicating, taking so much money away from public schools that they just can't fund themselves anymore? What does that world look like?
Well, let me just tell you what it would look like financially for those who care about that end of things. A 2021 policy brief estimated what it would cost to institute universal vouchers across the country, and estimated that it would increase the total cost to the public by 11 to 33%. So that's $66 to $203 billion per year that would cost. But in terms of what you're asking, what would happen if vouchers spread across the country if voucher proponents won. This is not just about vouchers. This is about a multi-pronged attack on public schools. And so that context is key. We've talked about the chronic underfunding of public schools. That's such a longstanding problem, and how schools are starved of resources that research shows would lead to better outcomes. And then public schools are criticized for underperforming, right? And then more recently, policies like book bans and the censorship of teaching about topics like race and gender and truthful teaching about these subjects, those are also attempts to undermine confidence in public schools and then create these false justifications to further underfund them and to funnel money into private school vouchers and similar programs. And then we have the prong of attack that is directly the vouchers and the push and the increase of public funds going to private education through vouchers and similar programs. So it's not only about vouchers, it's not only about education. Right? Public education is the cornerstone of our democracy, and there's a multi-pronged attack on our democracy. So what will happen if vouchers take over? I think the answer is we can't let that happen. Those who believe in this fundamental institution of our public schools are standing up on school boards, in state houses, in classrooms, in courtrooms, and people of goodwill will not let that happen.
So I just can't believe that these guys, that whoever, I mean, it seems like, these overlords, right? Like this is where these overlords, which I don't believe it because we're such a plurality in America. We don't really have overlords, but we do have the 1%, which is getting smaller. Kleptocracy or whatever it's called. But are they really out to destroy democracy? Is that the ultimate goal? Is to get, I mean, obviously there's attacks on democracy everywhere, but one would think it's only because we got guys like Trump who just really want to be king. But is it really a concerted effort, by the gazillionaires to actually ruin democracy in America? To me, it seems like people just want to get rich off of tax dollars. But is it more of an attack on democracy? Or is it more of a cynical, corrupt way to get rich?
I think only those who are pushing these terrible policies know, and I'm sure people have different motivations. And to be very clear, it's not
very loyally of you.
Individual families who choose different types of schooling are not the issue. And we are not faulting anyone for choosing whatever they think is the best route for their kids. What we have a problem with are the systems and the powerful forces that are pushing this for lots of wrong reasons, I'm sure, and the effect. The effect is indisputable. And the other side wants to spread misinformation about the effects, but the effects that we see from the real research, the peer-reviewed research, the valid research, are that vouchers undermine public schools. They increase segregation. They fund discrimination. They don't improve academic outcomes. They decrease academic outcomes. So at the very fundamental level of what education reform policies are supposed to do, it fails.
So I before I get to another question, so how do we participate in this? How do we push this back and improve outcomes for all of our kids, for all students?
Lots of different ways. There are so many different ways that we can all work together and that people are already working together. We always work with state and local groups because that's who knows what resonates in your state, what people care about, what's happening on the ground. And so you need to tailor what you're talking about to, of course, to your audience, as you know well. And there are different arguments that are going to hit differently with different policymakers, with the different segments of the public. But we provide public funds, public schools, a lot of different advocacy tools. So if you go to our website, pfps.org, you'll see fact sheets and policy briefs that talk about these different arguments against vouchers, and you choose. If you want to talk about the cost, we've talked a lot about the cost to the public. If you want to talk about how public schools are already under-resourced, if you want to talk about the multiple ways that vouchers fund discrimination, talking about those different arguments. Being active in the local community, not just to talk about the ills of vouchers, but also to talk about the amazing things that are going on in public schools is so important. Because public schools, polls show that people are overwhelmingly happy with their local public school. And then there's a false national narrative of dissatisfaction with public schools, but people are overwhelmingly happy with their neighborhood public school and their child's public school. Not to say that public schools don't need to improve in many ways, in many places. And we're working for that too, to fund them better, to make sure they're welcoming to all students. But in public schools are the only ones where students retain all their rights, where we can enforce their rights and where we can work toward something better for all students rather than something that's not good for a few students.
Okay, so because my group and working with other education groups in Wisconsin are going to be bringing this lawsuit soon, and we also need to convince the public that we're not doing anything wrong to harming students. I've heard through our awesome partner, Dr. Julie Underwood, who found you guys and works with you guys, that you've done work in Tennessee and Kentucky. Your organization has litigation or helping support various litigation. Can you talk a little bit more about how you won or how you moved the needle on voucher schools and getting rid of them in Tennessee and Kentucky?
Sure. Well, so litigation is one, so bringing this to the courts is one really important tool that we use to push back against vouchers. It can't stand alone. You can't just go to court. You have to have a public advocacy effort and advocating in legislatures and so many other things. But litigation is a really important tool when these laws pass because there are so many ways that they are illegal. And many of these cases, including the ones you mentioned, focus on violations of state constitutions. For example, the ways that voucher programs violate what are called education articles in state constitutions that guarantee public education to all the students of the state, and the ways that voucher programs violate various guarantees in those provisions and in the rest of the Constitution. So we are litigating in Tennessee right now against the Education Savings Account voucher program there. We have litigated in the past in places like Nevada, where we took their universal voucher up to the Nevada Supreme Court, and the Nevada Supreme Court struck it down because it was unconstitutional. So courts are also striking down these programs. I'm glad you mentioned Kentucky, because I think that's a wonderful bright spot in the fight against vouchers very recently. Now, that was not Public Funds, Public Schools case. That was litigated by other wonderful attorneys and plaintiffs, but we did support that case through being what's called a friend of the court, writing a brief and telling them about a lot of the harms of vouchers so they would have that context. But the Kentucky Supreme Court ruled that the voucher law that was passed there in 2021 violated the mandate in the Kentucky Constitution that taxation for education be spent only on the public schools unless otherwise approved by the voters. And the voucher program was passed. It was not, there was not approval by the voters to use tax money for something other than the public schools when it was raised for education. And so the Supreme Court struck it down. A lot of times these are really straightforward arguments. That doesn't mean it's not a lot of hard work to bring these cases, but voucher laws are often being enacted in the face of really clear constitutional mandates against them, and we can't let that happen. Everybody is the same under the law, and we have to protect people under their state constitutions.
It feels like that's kind of the point, is to keep forcing this into the courts. It doesn't, like, the goal is to also deplete the resources of those who are pushing back. So tell us tell us a little bit about your organization and how it works.
Sure. Well, I am the acting litigation director at Education Law Center, which is a nonprofit organization that pursues justice and equity for public school students by enforcing their right to a high quality education in safe, well-funded, non-discriminatory public schools. And the Public Funds, Public Schools campaign is a campaign that that Education Law Center directs to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen our public schools and aren't diverted to vouchers. So that's the short answer. And there are a lot of things that we're doing around the country to support the many, many groups, advocates, students, families, teachers who are standing up against vouchers.
Jessica, why aren't we working with you right now? Why isn't Monaco Brewing a super PAC who's going to bring this lawsuit? You got to help us. You know a lot of stuff. We got experts too, but my gosh, I'm happy we're sitting on this thing together because we're about to file a lawsuit and it sounds like you guys could help us. Let's talk.
I'm happy that we're talking, and we are happy to talk to anyone around the country who is engaging in litigation or advocacy, research, communications efforts. We would love to talk about how to support anyone who is listening who is part of this effort.
We drink a lot of beer at our super PAC, and super PACs are really bad, but we try to do the right thing, even while slightly inebriated. I guarantee you this.
Which sounds like fun as well. Because we've mentioned places where they have been able to push back. Has there been one particular technique that worked, like in Texas or Arizona, that you see? Because you mentioned also earlier the Supreme Court, when they said that if you are funding private schools, you also have to fund use the vouchers for parochial for religious schools based on a First Amendment right. So what are some of the techniques that you can use with our existing laws to push back?
I think the key is to use all the strategies, to use a multifaceted approach. So to think about how you can advocate to policymakers, to how do you communicate, as you are right now, these truths about vouchers to the public, to the media, to think about litigation, but not litigation standing alone, wrapped around these other efforts. So to think about all those different strategies, research, getting the research out there, and then also to think about, all the different prongs of argument. As I said, it's kind of hard to choose which one to focus on first, right? Because vouchers have so many negatives, from the fiscal consequences to the discrimination, to the segregation, to the decreased academic outcomes. But to get all those out there, because people care most about different things.
So this is funny that you asked that question, Patti, because I'm open. Don't worry, I'll get to the point in a second, I promise. I'm opening up a new tap room in Madison, Wisconsin, and my landlord leans to the right on this, and he's like, Kirk, so I don't know if I should. He's like gonna lease it to me, but he's like, Kirk, I don't know if I'm like opening up a can of worms by letting you like be in my building because you're so progressive, and he's like, aren't you? I've heard you're suing everybody, and I'm like, and I told him that we're doing this voucher school thing, and I said the reason we're suing against voucher schools is because your tax dollars, and this guy's a Republican, I was like, your tax dollars are going to help people send their own kids to private schools who are going to send them to private schools anyways. And he was like, no way, that's not the truth. He's like, you're a Democrat, you're just lying to me. And I'm like, no, that's the truth. He's like, well, that's crazy. I would never let my public tax dollars go to let some other parent send their kid to private schools. And he's like, why don't the Republicans tell me this? And I'm like, well, there's a reason. They're not telling you this. So to me, the message that turned a Republican who supports everything that Republicans do, but didn't know anything about this voucher system and what it actually does, that turned him. Is that the best argument that you're seeing across the country, or are there other ones that are just as effective?
I mean, it's one of the most powerful arguments, and unfortunately it gets more powerful all the time. The more and more that spending increases, the more and more, because it's all public funds. And even if it's a tax credit voucher, I mean, that's another way that that there's an attempt to sort of just launder the money, basically. So the way that tax credit vouchers work is that individuals or corporations give money to a third-party organization that's going to distribute vouchers, and they get a tax credit for that. And it might be even up to 100% tax credit. So, calling it a donation is not right, but they're called donations often, but it's not charitable. They're giving money to a third-party organization that then distributes the vouchers. And so, yes, the fiscal arguments are resonate with a lot of people, of all persuasions, because our public funding, our public fisc is stretched. And so and now as more and more research comes out showing what you mentioned, Kirk, that a lot of vouchers are being used by very high income families, it just doesn't make any sense.
No, it's unconscionable that they were going to send their kids there anyway. And there are different requirements across the country, as far as like sometimes there'll be income requirements or a requirement that they had to have already been in a public school, as though they are choosing to leave that public school too. Is that an aspect of this?
That's right. The more and more they're getting eroded. So on both those fronts. So a lot of voucher programs started out with an income eligibility requirement. Some still have it. Of course, lots still have it, but it often gets raised from 200%, 250, 300 until you're up to 400% or 500. And it's not really any sort of cap, right? And then also prior public school enrollment requirement. That's right. A lot of voucher programs have that. Increasingly, we are seeing it disappear, which of course opens the floodgates to families that are already paying for private school or never would have put their kids in public school taking a voucher as well. And those are the universal voucher states. So they include Arizona, Iowa, Utah, Florida.
Iowa. Talk a little bit about Iowa. That's universal. So there's no caps on anybody. The richest parents can take vouchers for their kids in Iowa. That's true.
Iowa was one of the recent. So the sort of phenomenon about of universal vouchers is very recent. And so Arizona was the first state to universalize its voucher program last year. And then Iowa was one of the ones that passed a universal voucher program in the last.
Let me follow up. Is that ALEC? Is that the So ALEC, to everybody that's not listening, is this crazy Republican group that tries to plant the same language in all 50 states and if the Republicans are in the majority, then they kind of pass all this stuff. They did a lot of transgender stuff recently. I can't remember, legislative council or something, but is this an ALEC thing, the universal voucher, or not?
ALEC is one of the groups that, has model legislation. And so, you can never know exactly where a specific, I guess sometimes you might be able to, someone got their language. But what I can tell you is that we track, as I said, voucher bills across the country in every state legislature. We read hundreds of these bills every year, and they look very similar. There's very similar language. There's very similar permutations, and there's very similar sort of ways that they morph, because they're constantly morphing. They morph the names because they know that vouchers are a bad word with the public. And so they use other names to try to obscure what it is. They put in other very sophisticated mechanisms to try to evade court challenges. And so we do see these things proliferating. It's hard to believe that it would be a coincidence.
I have to ask you a personal question. How do you keep your wits about you when you're going up against this kind of madness, really? What is Professor Jessica Levin do?
Evil people doing these things.
I mean,
yeah, it's a good
do you
question.
meditate? Do you drink some progressive brew? What do you do?
I should. I think it's because of there are so many others. Kirk, as you were alluding to, we're not alone. That's what keeps us all going in fighting for our public schools. That and the existential threat, how essential public schools are to children and to our democracy. And so knowing that there are hundreds and thousands and millions of people across the country, there are so many issues to pay attention to, but people are paying attention to this issue and they are standing up. And we are very proud to support them and very proud to represent them in court and to do everything we can to help them.
Amazing, amazing work. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you.
So, Jessica, this has been great. So I just wanted to kind of summarize this whole hour. We've moved from just Wisconsin, where we're trying to do a local action, and we're hopefully going to file a complaint. Finally, it's been a long time in coming. I've been trying to raise lots of money to do this because we got expensive lawyers. Apparently, I might have been able to get some free lawyers. Had we talked to you earlier? I don't know. We'll talk about that later. But
free to who?
But we've talked about our case. We've talked about Wisconsin, and now we've talked about how seemingly there are people that are like holding like minarets. They're like holding. Am I saying it right? Holding the strings to society by trying to destroy public schools, and it's not just happening in Wisconsin. It's happening in a programmatic and systematic way around the country, and it's really scary. It's super scary. So I wanted just to thank you for helping us shed a light on that. We're going to be putting some of your smartest comments in 60-second bits all over the internet so that we can convince Wisconsinites that this is something that we need to pay attention to. We can't dumb down our kids. But I also wanted to talk about next week and let everybody tune in that we're moving on to how voucher schools and how voucher programs affect public school teachers. Obviously, it's a very negative thing. They're getting paid less. They're getting less pensions. They're leaving states and moving to states that treat them better, like Minnesota and Illinois, and not Wisconsin. So we're going to talk to Bob Baxter, who's the executive director of the Wisconsin Teachers Union, which is called WEAC, the Wisconsin Education I don't even know what it stands for. It's a teachers union. And then we're going to be talking to Heather Bornaham, who is the executive director for the Wisconsin Public Education Network, which is the group we got Julie Underwood from, who is like the keeper. They're like the oracle, the keeper of wisdom in Wisconsin, just like your organization is for the United States. They're the folks in Wisconsin that are trying to ensure that we don't miss all these horrible things that are happening and to try to alert the public that it's happening. So to tune in next week for that. But I just want to get that out. But you also should all go to what's your website again, Jessica, to make sure that people can get it from the horse's mouth. I hate to say horse's mouth because I shouldn't, but anyways.
for public funds, public schools, pfps.org. And feel free to contact us.
We will be here for a couple moments on Facebook Live, but I want to thank everybody for joining us. Mike Crute is up next with Devil's Advocates. Thank you, Alex and Matt and Jerry and everybody. For those of you tuning in, you can go to TuneIn to continue listening to WCPT 820. Bye, everybody.
You're listening to the Right Wing War on Education, brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company.